In 1513, while Henry VIII was off playing soldier in France, his pregnant wife rode a horse toward battle and won him the greatest military victory of his entire reign. And you've probably never heard about it. That's not an accident. That's 500 years of men writing history about other men, editing out the women who actually got things done. Today, we're going to fix that, because the story of the Tudor dynasty isn't really about Henry VIII and his 6 wives. It's about the women he tried to destroy, and how every single one of them proved they were more competent than he ever was. But first, I know what some of you are thinking. What about Lady Jane Grey? She was technically the first Queen of England. And you're right to ask. Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen of England on July 10, 1553, and she held that title for exactly 9 days before the Privy Council switched sides and handed the crown to Mary I. So, was she the first queen regnant? Historians still argue about it. She was proclaimed, but never crowned. She ruled for 9 days, but never ruled independently. She was 16 or 17 years old and completely controlled by her father-in-law, the Duke of Northumberland, who had manipulated the dying Edward VI into changing the succession. When they told her she was queen, contemporary accounts say she fainted. She reportedly said, "The crown is not my right, and pleaseth me not." 9 days later, she was in the Tower. 7 months after that, on February 12, 1554, she was dead. Beheaded at 16 or 17 years old because powerful men used her as a pawn in their political games. Jane deserves to be remembered. She went through hell. But for the purposes of this story, we're focusing on the women who fought back and who won. Mary I became the first woman to rule England in her own right, unopposed and unchallenged, and she had to raise an army to take back what was hers. Now, back to that pregnant woman on a horse. Katherine of Aragon wasn't some delicate flower waiting for her husband to return from war. She was the daughter of Isabella of Castile, a woman who personally led troops in the Reconquista, traveled with her armies while pregnant, gave birth in war camps, and taught her daughters that military strategy was as natural a part of royal education as needlework. Katherine was fluent in Latin, French, and Greek. She studied arithmetic, canon and civil law, classical literature, philosophy, religion, theology, genealogy, and heraldry. When she arrived in England at 15 to marry Prince Arthur, she was better educated than most English noblemen. When Arthur died 6 months later and she spent years stranded in a foreign country while diplomats haggled over her future, she learned survival. So when Henry VIII sailed off to France in 1513 with the bulk of England's fighting force, leaving Katherine as regent, a courtesy title everyone assumed, nobody expected her to actually do anything. She was supposed to sit around and look pretty while the real men made decisions. Then James IV of Scotland invaded with 30,000 men, one of the largest Scottish armies ever assembled. This should have been a catastrophe. England's defenses were stripped bare. The army was across the Channel. Henry was playing dress-up in armor somewhere near Calais, capturing minor French towns and congratulating himself on his martial prowess. And Katherine of Aragon, 27 years old, reportedly pregnant, definitely not interested in letting her husband's kingdom get conquered, became a military commander. The transformation was immediate. Within days of learning about the Scottish invasion, Katherine was dispatching urgent letters across England. Not polite requests, demands. She wanted exact counts of how many men and horses each parish could supply. She ordered the royal wardrobe to produce banners emblazoned with the combined arms of England and Spain. A visual statement that this was her war now, fought under her authority. She sent £10,000 to the Earl of Surrey, along with artillery, gunners, a fleet of ships, grain, beer, and 1,500 complete sets of armor. She organized an army of roughly 26,000 men under Surrey's command and sent them racing north to intercept the Scottish force before it could penetrate deeper into English territory. And then, according to the contemporary chronicler Peter Martyr d'Anghiera, she intended to ride north herself, reportedly in armor adapted to accommodate a pregnancy. Modern historians debate whether this specific detail is reliable or apocryphal. What the documents absolutely confirm is that Katherine was in Buckingham, 60 miles north of London, when she received news of the victory. She had intended to travel further north to address her troops personally before battle. The fighting concluded before she could reach them. But let's talk about that battle. The Battle of Flodden, September 9th, 1513. The English army, following Katherine's strategic directives, caught James IV on Branxton Hill near the Scottish border. The Earl of Surrey was 70 years old, a veteran who understood that this wasn't just a military engagement, but a defense of everything England stood for while its king was absent. The Scots had the high ground initially, but Surrey maneuvered his forces to draw them down into the boggy terrain below. Scottish pikes, which were longer and more unwieldy than English bills, became liabilities in the mud. What should have been a Scottish advantage turned into a death trap. The fighting lasted 3 hours. It was carnage. King James IV of Scotland died on the field, cut down while trying to reach the Earl of Surrey in personal combat. With him died approximately 10,000 of his men, 12 earls, 14 lords, an archbishop, a bishop, 2 abbots. The flower of Scottish nobility, crushed so completely that Scotland would not recover for a generation. The Scottish army that had crossed the border as one of the most formidable forces in British history retreated as a shattered remnant. English casualties numbered only around 1,500. It was an annihilation. The most devastating defeat Scotland had suffered in centuries. And it happened because Katherine of Aragon organized the response, supplied the army, directed the strategy, and pushed her commanders north with the urgency the situation demanded. 3 days later, on September 16, 1513, Katherine sat down and wrote a letter to her husband. The casualness of it barely conceals her pride. She informed Henry of the victory, mentioned some administrative details, and then, almost as an afterthought, noted that she was sending him a piece of King James IV's bloodied coat as a trophy. But here's the part historians usually skip past too quickly. Katherine originally wanted to send Henry the Scottish king's actual body. "I thought to send himself unto you," she wrote, "but our English men's hearts would not suffer it." Her soldiers had to talk her down from shipping a royal corpse across the channel as a present. Let that sink in for a moment. While Henry VIII was capturing minor French towns and writing home about his glorious adventures, his wife had killed a king. She'd organized an army from nothing, directed a defensive war across hundreds of miles, and delivered an enemy monarch's head on a metaphorical platter. And for 500 years, the men who wrote the history books either minimized this achievement or credited it entirely to the Earl of Surrey and his generals. New documents discovered at the United Kingdom's National Archives have changed that narrative. As historian Sean Cunningham noted, the Queen was more deeply involved as a director of events rather than a passive figurehead managed by those of Henry's counselors left in England. Katherine won this war. Full stop. The victory at Flodden was hers. So what did Henry do with this incredibly competent, brilliant military commander wife of his? He spent the next 20 years trying to replace her. Here's where the propaganda really kicks in. Everything you think you know about Katherine of Aragon, that she was stubborn, proud, difficult, unable to let go, came from accounts written by men who wanted her gone. Henry VIII ran one of the most effective PR operations in English history. He controlled the narrative so completely that 5 centuries later, people still talk about Catherine like she was the problem in that marriage. The annulment proceedings began formally in 1527. What followed was 6 years of sustained psychological warfare designed to break Catherine's will. Henry deployed the Pope, the English church establishment, English courts, Catherine's own confessor, her household servants, and eventually threats of violence against her person and her daughter Mary. Catherine refused. For 6 years, she refused. On June 21, 1529, at the Blackfriars Court convened to hear the annulment case, she delivered one of the most remarkable speeches any queen has ever given. She walked across the courtroom, knelt before Henry, spoke directly to him, in fluent English, which was not her native tongue, without notes, without hesitation. She reminded him that she had been a true and faithful wife for 20 years. She declared that when she came to him as his bride, she came as a virgin, directly contradicting his entire legal argument that her previous marriage to his brother Arthur had been consummated. Then she rose, curtsied, and walked out of the court. When officials called her back, she refused to return. She said she didn't recognize the court's authority over her marriage. She was appealing over Henry's head to the Pope, to her nephew Emperor Charles V, to all of Catholic Europe. She was making it absolutely clear that forcing through this annulment would require more than legal technicalities. It would require destroying her reputation entirely. And she was right to fight. Because Henry VIII himself, according to the Spanish ambassador Eustace Chapuis, warned his counselors that, were the Lady Catherine, who is a proud and intractable woman, to take into her head to favor her daughter, she might well take the field, raise assemblies of men, and carry on war against him as openly and fiercely as Queen Isabella, her mother, did in Spain. Read that again. Henry called her proud and intractable as an insult. Those same qualities would have been called determined and principled in a man. But beneath the propaganda spin, his words reveal something important. Henry was afraid of her. He knew exactly what she was capable of. He'd seen it at Flodden. Catherine was eventually defeated. Henry broke with Rome, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, had Thomas Cranmer annul the marriage on May 23, 1533, and married Anne Boleyn. Catherine was banished from court, moved from castle to castle, forbidden to see her daughter marry. But she never conceded. Never. She refused to accept the title Dowager Princess of Wales that Henry tried to impose on her. She continued to call herself Queen of England until her death in January 1536. Her final letter to Henry was signed, Catherine the Queen. She died unbroken, and her defiance lived on in her daughters. But before we get to those daughters, we need to talk about Anne Boleyn, because the propaganda machine has gotten her wrong too. The story everyone knows goes like this. Anne Boleyn was a scheming seductress who stole Catherine's husband, a homewrecker, an ambitious climber who used her sexuality to destroy a marriage and break England from Rome. That narrative was written by men who needed her to be a villain, first to justify Catherine's treatment, then to justify Anne's own execution. Here's what actually happened. Anne Boleyn was one of the most educated women in England. She'd spent years at the French court, arguably the most sophisticated court in Europe, where she learned French, music, dancing, and the art of conversation. When she returned to England around 1522, she was 21 years old and considerably more cultured than most of the English nobility. Henry noticed her. He wanted her as his mistress. Anne said no. This is the part that gets glossed over. Henry VIII was the most powerful man in England. Kings took mistresses. It was expected. Accepted. normal. Other women, including Anne's own sister Mary, had shared Henry's bed and been discarded when he tired of them. Anne watched this happen, and she decided, not me. She refused to sleep with Henry unless he married her. For 7 years, from roughly 1526 to 1533, she held that line. She was gambling everything on one condition: legitimacy. She would be queen, or she would be nothing. And for 7 years, she won that bet. She kept Henry pursuing her while he tore apart his kingdom, trying to get the annulment that would make marriage possible. Was this ambition? Obviously. Was it also the only rational strategy for a woman in her position? Absolutely. Anne understood what happened to royal mistresses. They got used. They got pregnant. They got abandoned. The only protection a woman could have in Henry's orbit was the crown itself. She wasn't stupid. She was calculating. And for a while, it worked. Anne became queen on June 1st, 1533. She gave birth to Elizabeth on September 7th of that year, but she failed, in Henry's eyes, to produce a son. 2 miscarriages, no male heir. And Henry, who had destroyed his international reputation, broken with the Pope, and executed friends who opposed the marriage, began looking for someone to blame. Anne was arrested on May 2nd, 1536. The charges were ludicrous: adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, conspiracy to murder the king. The alleged dates of her affairs didn't match her documented whereabouts. The men accused alongside her confessed under torture, or the threat of it. The whole trial was a legal lynching designed to get rid of a queen who hadn't produced a son. She was beheaded on May 19th, 1536. By most accounts, she faced her execution with extraordinary composure. She made a brief speech praising Henry, because even at the scaffold, saying anything else would have endangered her daughter. Her last act was protecting Elizabeth. Anne Boleyn wasn't a villain. She was a woman who played the only game available to her, and when the rules changed, she lost. The men who wrote her story made her a cautionary tale about female ambition. The truth is simpler and sadder. She was brilliant, she was ruthless, she was doomed the moment she failed to give Henry a son. Just like Katherine before her, just like the wives who would come after. But her daughter survived, and that daughter would have the last word. Mary Tudor was born on February 18th, 1516. For 11 years, she was the most precious child in England, the only surviving offspring of Henry and Katherine, the Princess of Wales, heir presumptive to the English throne, educated brilliantly, adored by both parents, groomed for either rulership or a magnificent marriage to a European prince. Then her father decided he wanted a new wife, and Mary's world collapsed. What happened next would today be recognized as prolonged psychological abuse designed to break a child's will. When Mary was 17, her parents' marriage was annulled. Overnight, she was declared illegitimate. She lost her title of princess and became merely the Lady Mary. She was removed from her own household, stripped of her servants, her tutors, her entire support structure, and forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting to her infant half-sister Elizabeth, the baby of Anne Boleyn, the woman who had displaced her mother. Every day, Mary had to attend to the child whose very existence represented her own humiliation. She was forbidden to see Katherine. Her mother was kept in isolated captivity, moved from one cold, damp manor house to another, while Mary was denied any contact. When Katherine died in January 1536, likely from cancer, possibly from something worse, Mary wasn't allowed to attend the funeral. She couldn't say goodbye. She couldn't grieve publicly. She was expected to simply accept that her mother was gone and that it was her own fault for being born to a woman Henry no longer wanted. Contemporary accounts describe Mary falling into what Tudor physicians called melancholy. And here's where we need to translate. because Tudor-era melancholy is what we now call clinical depression. When chroniclers noted Mary's fits of weeping and inability to take comfort, they were documenting what we'd recognize as anxiety and trauma response. She suffered from headaches so severe she couldn't function for days at a time, digestive problems that made eating painful, irregular menstruation that would later contribute to her phantom pregnancies, episodes of overwhelming despair that left her bedridden. Modern historians and psychologists who've examined these accounts frequently identify symptoms consistent with what we now call complex post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorder, and major depression, all of which would be expected responses to sustained trauma from a parental figure. Mary wasn't weak. Mary wasn't unstable. Mary wasn't mentally deficient. Mary was a teenage girl whose father systematically tried to psychologically destroy her for years, and she showed textbook symptoms of what that kind of abuse does to a developing mind. The language was different. The suffering was exactly the same. But here's what gets left out of most histories about Mary Tudor. She didn't just survive this abuse. She resisted it. Henry demanded that Mary sign a document acknowledging her own illegitimacy. He wanted her to declare, in writing, that her mother's marriage was invalid and that she herself was a bastard with no claim to the throne. He also demanded she accept him as supreme head of the Church of England, renouncing the Catholic faith that connected her to her mother. Mary refused. Henry threatened her, isolated her further, cut off her household funds, reportedly contemplated having her executed for treason, his own daughter, tried and killed for refusing to call herself a bastard. For years, Mary held out. She held out longer than Thomas More, longer than John Fisher, longer than almost anyone else Henry VIII pressured during the Reformation. She finally signed only when supporters convinced her that continued resistance would mean death, and that a dead Mary could never become queen, could never take back what her father had stolen, could never vindicate her mother's memory. She signed to survive, but she never forgot what it cost her. Elizabeth had it worse in some ways. Born September 7th, 1533, the daughter Henry had destroyed his marriage, his church, and his international reputation to conceive. For 3 years, she was the heir, the precious princess, the future. Then her mother was arrested. Anne Boleyn was charged with adultery, incest, and treason on evidence that was almost certainly fabricated. She was beheaded on May 19, 1536. Elizabeth was 2 years and 8 months old. Like Mary before her, Elizabeth was declared illegitimate. Her household was broken up, her status reduced from princess to bastard, her future made completely uncertain. She was a toddler, and she would grow up knowing that her father had killed her mother. The childhood that followed was a masterclass in survival under impossible conditions. Elizabeth's position at court rose and fell with her father's moods and marriages. She was restored to favor, then threatened again. She learned very young that showing the wrong emotion, saying the wrong thing, trusting the wrong person, could mean death. She watched her stepmothers come and go, some executed, some divorced, some dying in childbirth. She understood that being close to Henry VIII was the most dangerous position in England. Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547, when Elizabeth was 13 years old. His death did not bring safety. It brought new dangers. During the reign of her younger half-brother Edward VI, Elizabeth faced scandal and near destruction. Thomas Seymour, the Lord Admiral, a charming, ambitious man who had married Henry's widow Katherine Parr, made inappropriate advances toward Elizabeth. He would enter her bedchambers while she was still in bed, tickle her, grab her. The advances escalated. Some historians believe what happened constituted sexual abuse of a teenage girl by a man in a position of authority. Elizabeth was 14, then 15. She had no power to stop him. When Catherine Parr died in childbirth in 1548, Seymour renewed his pursuit of Elizabeth, not for romance, but for access to the throne. He was arrested for treason in January 1549. And suddenly Elizabeth, 15 years old, was being interrogated about whether she had agreed to marry him, whether she had conspired with him, whether she was part of his treasonous plots. The interrogations were relentless. Officials questioned her servants, searched for letters, looked for any evidence that could tie her to Seymour's schemes. Elizabeth's responses during this period are some of the earliest examples of her extraordinary survival instincts. She admitted nothing, denied nothing specific, expressed shock and horror at appropriate moments, gave her interrogators enough cooperation that they couldn't call her obstinate, but not enough information to incriminate herself. She was already learning that any connection to powerful men could cost her everything. Let's rewind to July 1553, because Mary's seizure of power is one of the most remarkable military achievements in Tudor history, and it's almost never framed that way. Edward VI died on July 6, 1553, at 15 years old. Probably tuberculosis, definitely the end of Henry VIII's dreams. His precious male heir, the son he'd destroyed his first marriage to conceive, the child he'd broken with Rome to legitimize, dead before his 16th birthday. The Duke of Northumberland had spent Edward's final months preparing for this moment. He'd married his son Guilford Dudley to Lady Jane Grey, the great-granddaughter of Henry VII. He'd convinced the dying Edward to change the succession, bypassing both Mary and Elizabeth in favor of Jane. When Edward died, Northumberland proclaimed Jane queen and sent armed men to capture Mary before she could rally support. He expected Mary to fold, to accept her defeat, to remember that she was just a woman, illegitimate, powerless against the armed might of the state. He didn't know who he was dealing with. Mary received warning that her brother was dead and that she was in danger. Instead of waiting to be captured, she fled east, away from London, away from Northumberland's forces, to Framlingham Castle in Suffolk. It was a gamble. She was betting that the English people would support the rightful heir over Northumberland's puppet queen. She was betting that her mother's example meant something, that Catherine's defiance had taught her daughter how to fight. She was right. From Framlingham, Mary issued a proclamation declaring herself the true queen, and the country responded. The Earl of Bath arrived with his retainers. The Earl of Sussex brought armed men from his estates. Sir Henry Bedingfield, who would later serve as Elizabeth's jailer, rode to Framlingham with soldiers and pledged his sword. Local gentry flooded in from across East Anglia, bringing whatever men they could muster. In the harbour at Yarmouth, 6 ships of the Royal Navy mutinied against Northumberland's orders and declared for Mary, taking their guns, their sailors, and their strategic position with them. Within days, Mary had assembled an army of nearly 20,000 men, raised from nothing, organized through force of will, loyal to a woman who had spent her entire adult life being told she was worthless. In London, Northumberland watched his support evaporate. The Privy Council members who had sworn to uphold Jane's claim began slipping away in the night. The Earl of Arundel and the Earl of Pembroke, both of whom had signed the documents proclaiming Jane, quietly switched sides and began organizing Mary's reception in London. On July 19, 1553, 9 days after proclaiming Jane, the remaining councillors gathered at Beheaded's castle and declared Mary the rightful Queen of England. The herald who announced it was nearly crushed by celebrating crowds. Mary entered London in triumph on August 3, 1553. She had done exactly what Henry VIII feared Katherine might do. She had taken the field, raised assemblies of men, carried on war against her enemies as openly and fiercely as her grandmother Isabella had done in Spain. Remember that. Mary didn't inherit her throne. She took it. Mary reigned for 5 years, and the histories written about her have been shaped by centuries of Protestant propaganda. Bloody Mary, that's what they called her, for executing roughly 280 Protestant heretics during her reign. A grim toll, yes, but one that pales beside her father's record. The Bloody Mary nickname barely existed during her actual lifetime. It was invented later by Protestant writers and Victorian historians, who had their own reasons to demonize Catholic rulers. They needed Mary to be a monster so that Elizabeth, the Protestant queen, could be a saint. What the propaganda obscures is the psychological damage Mary carried onto the throne. The phantom pregnancies that plagued her reign, episodes where she believed herself pregnant, experienced physical symptoms of pregnancy, announced impending births that never materialized, are often presented as embarrassing failures, evidence of mental instability, proof that women couldn't be trusted with power. What they actually demonstrate is the depth of trauma her father had inflicted. Henry VIII spent Mary's entire adolescence telling her that her only value lay in producing heirs, that she was worthless as illegitimate, that the only thing that could redeem her was fertility. He'd destroyed her mother for failing to produce a son. He'd remarried 6 times, chasing male heirs. Mary absorbed that message so deeply that her body began acting it out, producing the symptoms of pregnancy when no pregnancy existed, desperate to prove that she could do what her father demanded. That she continued to rule effectively despite this ongoing psychological burden isn't a failure. It's evidence of extraordinary resilience. Mary died on November 17, 1558, at 42 years old, likely from cancer. She died without children. Her half-sister Elizabeth, the Protestant hope, inherited everything. But Elizabeth's path to the throne had one more hell to walk through first. When Mary took power in 1553, Elizabeth was immediately suspect. Protestant conspiracies began forming almost immediately. The most dangerous was the Wyatt Rebellion of January 1554. It failed, and Elizabeth was accused of involvement. On March 18, 1554, Elizabeth was taken to the Tower of London. The Tower, where her mother had been imprisoned for 18 days before her execution, where Anne Boleyn had walked to the scaffold and put her head on the block. Elizabeth reportedly wept as the barge approached Traitor's Gate. She pleaded not to be sent there. She knew exactly what that fortress meant for accused traitors. She spent 2 months imprisoned in the Tower, expecting every day might be her last. Every footstep in the corridor could be guards coming to take her to her death. She wrote a letter to Mary, careful, precise, defending herself with extraordinary rhetorical skill while admitting nothing that could be used against her. Mary, to her credit, refused to execute her sister. But Elizabeth's ordeal wasn't over. She was placed under house arrest at Woodstock for nearly a year, watched constantly, her correspondence monitored, her visitors restricted. She existed in limbo between freedom and the executioner's block. The girl who emerged from this crucible, who survived having her mother executed at 2, being declared illegitimate at 3, being sexually preyed upon at 14, being interrogated for treason at 15, being imprisoned in the Tower at 20, that girl would become the greatest monarch in English history, and she never forgot what nearly killed her. Elizabeth I reigned for 45 years. She never married, never produced an heir. Every European prince who proposed was examined, negotiated with, and ultimately rejected. Her counselors begged her to marry, Parliament petitioned her, ambassadors pleaded. She refused them all. The history books call this the marriage question and analyze it as foreign policy. But think about what Elizabeth had seen. Her father married 6 times and executed 2 of his wives. Her mother was beheaded. Katherine of Aragon was discarded. Anne of Cleves was humiliated. Catherine Howard was killed. Even Catherine Parr, who survived Henry, nearly ended up in the Tower. Elizabeth watched her sister Mary marry Philip of Spain and spend her reign trying desperately to produce an heir, while her husband spent most of his time in other countries. She watched Mary's phantom pregnancies. She watched Mary die, broken and childless. Elizabeth learned something that no one intended to teach her. Marriage was how women got destroyed. So she refused it. She called herself Married to England. She used her unmarried status as a diplomatic tool, always dangling the possibility of marriage to keep foreign powers interested, never actually committing. She turned what should have been a weakness into a weapon. And she survived. Plots against her, assassination attempts, the constant threat of Catholic Europe. Mary, Queen of Scots, imprisoned in England for 19 years, a permanent magnet for conspiracies. Elizabeth outlasted all of it when she died on March 24, 1603, at 69 years old. She had reigned longer than her father, her brother, and her sister combined. The Tudor dynasty ended with her, a woman who refused to play by the rules men had written for women. Henry VIII's worst nightmare had come true. His line ended with a daughter, and that daughter made it glorious. And now we arrive at the karma. Henry VIII destroyed his first marriage to get a male heir. He broke with the Roman Catholic Church. He executed wives. He declared both his daughters illegitimate. He spent his entire reign obsessed with one thing: a son to continue the Tudor dynasty. He got his son, Edward VI. Edward died at 15, accomplished almost nothing, left no heir. Both daughters Henry had declared illegitimate. They became queen. Mary I reigned for 5 years. Elizabeth I reigned for 45 years and became arguably the greatest monarch in English history. The Tudor dynasty ended with Elizabeth, a woman, Henry's worst nightmare. The thing he'd destroyed everything to prevent. But here's what Henry didn't understand, couldn't understand, refused to understand. His daughters didn't fail the dynasty. They were the dynasty's greatest success. Catherine of Aragon won him his greatest military victory, and he thanked her by trying to erase her from history. Mary survived psychological abuse that would have broken most people, raised an army, and took back her throne by force. Elizabeth survived the Tower, survived being the daughter of an executed mother, survived interrogations and house arrest and constant mortal danger, and became one of the most successful rulers in European history. The women won. The history books just forgot to mention it for 500 years. Everything we thought we knew about these women came from propaganda written by men who abused them, replaced them, or needed them to fail. Catherine wasn't stubborn, she was right, and she refused to pretend otherwise. Mary wasn't crazy. She was traumatized, and she still managed to take back her throne by force. Elizabeth wasn't lucky. She was brilliant, and she survived things that would have killed anyone else. Henry VIII didn't have more power than these women. He just had more chroniclers willing to tell his version of events. But chronicles can be corrected. 500 years late, sure, but corrected nonetheless. Subscribe for more stories like this.